Tony, when you're going to buy a new camera, what's the first thing you do?
Specs, that's all I need.
You look at
numbers.
The specs. But not all specs are created equally, because two 20 megapixel cameras are not the same. One might be sharper. And we've learned the hard way that a 70 to 200 millimeter lens might sometimes be a 70 to 135 millimeter lens. Specs don't always tell the full story, so we're going to be telling you what we learned to look for when shopping for a camera.
But first, a word from our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes beautiful websites incredibly simple. Drag your pictures in, organize them, write a few words about yourself, and you can instantly set up a store. You can take online bookings from clients with scheduling. You can process print orders and ship them off through ShipStation in just a few clicks. We use Squarespace for our websites, and you should check it out for yours too. Go to squarespace.com/Chelsea. If you love it, after the free trial, use the coupon code Chelsea to get 10% off. Thanks, Squarespace.
Okay, let's talk about the first one, Tony, and that's sharpness with the AA filter. So for those of you that don't know, the AA filter is kind of like a coating that goes on top of your sensor of your camera, and it impacts your photos a bit.
Yeah, its job is literally to blur your picture, to reduce sharpness. And it does this because if a picture is too sharp, it can develop moiré, especially around fabrics, and that will result in sort of like green and magenta fringing.
Yeah.
And if you're a fashion photographer and somebody's wearing corduroy, that could be incredibly annoying to try to clone out. So some manufacturers put on this AA filter, or OLPF filter they call it, to literally blur it so you don't get that issue. But if you're a wildlife photographer and you want as much detail as possible because you're always cropping really heavily, it's a real problem. And we discovered this the hard way because we were trying to find the best wildlife kit for people. And we got our day-to-day shooter, the Canon 7D Mark II at the time, and put it up against the brand new Nikon D500. We put the same third-party lenses like Sigma and Tamron 150 to 600, something like that. For some reason, the Nikon always produced sharper images. They both had 20 megapixel sensors. And I went back and forth testing it, checking the focal plane, everything.
Making sure it wasn't user error so you didn't get killed online.
Over and over and over again. And it was not. I eliminated every variable. And it turns out, even though the sensors had the same megapixels, the D500 was always going to be sharper because it didn't have that AA filter. The Canon had such a heavy AA filter that it was incapable of producing sharp cropped images.
Not all AA filters are created equally though, because my Canon R5 has an AA filter and you don't really see much of a difference. It still looks very sharp. That's something to consider. If you're taking photos for fashion or portraits, an AA filter is probably fine. It's definitely fine. But if you're taking something like landscape or wildlife, then you probably don't want one.
Or it could be okay, as is the case in the Canon R5.
Yeah.
But there's no measurement for it. We don't actually know. We know it's reducing the visible detail that you see, but nobody gives us a measurement like this is a heavy or a light AA filter. This AA filter is going to produce 15 megapixels. No, we don't know.
Can you even get the AA filter details? Would you have to write the company? Do they reveal that type of thing?
They often won't even tell you whether or not it has an AA filter on it at all.
That's complicated. Okay, the next one is the focal length of your lens at the minimal focus distance.
Yeah, something photographers call focus breathing.
Yeah.
Okay, so remember how we learned this the hard way?
Everything? Why do we have to learn everything the hard way?
Because nobody else will tell you this stuff. We were shooting with the Nikon D810, just testing it. And for our day-to-day shooting, we were doing lots of portraits and weddings and stuff. We were shooting with the Canon 5D Mark III. And this D810 produced such great dynamic range, such sharp images with its high-resolution sensor that we decided we were going to switch to Nikon. And we got the Nikon 70-200, like paid out of pocket to buy it. And we're excitedly shooting our first portraits with it, but something was wrong. We couldn't pin it down, but the headshots that we were shooting just weren't the same.
Yeah, they look different than what we were accustomed to shooting. And then we went through it and we realized that if you were close to your subject and taking photos, then it wasn't actually a 200 millimeter lens. We were measuring it more at like 135 millimeters, which now wouldn't be relevant to me, honestly, because I shoot more wide angle portraits. But at the time, you think you're getting a certain focal length and it's not the case. And this happens quite often. I mean, your lens can change its focal length depending on how close you are to your subject. So when they do this measurement and they decide your lens is a 70-200 or whatever it is, they're focusing at infinity, as far away as the lens focuses, and then they're measuring the focal length. But they're not then, taking focusing a little bit closer and then seeing what the millimeters are. It's just they're doing that one measurement. Sometimes we check lenses for focus breathing. We don't really do it completely. We don't do a very thorough job of it because it would be kind of complicated.
Yeah, it can take some specialized equipment to try to measure this, so we don't always do it. But it is a major issue that manufacturers are aware of, but they just don't tell you about it in the marketing, even if it's an advantage for them. They don't mention it.
That's what's really weird, because sometimes there will be a great lens that doesn't have a lot of focus breathing, but they don't advertise that. So it's not really all about deception, even though it's like the lies of specs. It's really just kind of like the omitted information that could be relevant to you. And so if you're buying a lens and a particular focal length is important to you, you probably want to look it up and see if anybody's noticing any focus breathing.
So the practical impact on us is we delayed the switch to Nikon, and we made a video why we're not switching to Nikon.
Yeah.
And very shortly thereafter, Nikon released a revised version of their 70-200 that mostly cured that problem. And then we switched to Nikon. But these are like important hidden facts about the equipment that change our buying choices and many other people's too.
I wonder how they fix that.
Do you want a nerdy explanation of why focus breathing happens?
No.
Okay, well, I have a whole dedicated video.
You have a
about
video? Okay. We'll put the video in the link.
We'll put it at sdp.io/focus breathing.
Okay. This one was really interesting to me. The resolution of your EVF and of your screen on the back of your camera, it's pretty low. And because of that, they measure it in a weird way. And I always...
It sounds like a lot. It's 2 million dots.
Yeah. And I didn't realize this, Tony, but they actually measure it differently than most screens, like your monitor and your TV, right?
Yeah, like everybody knows, full HD is 1920 by 1080 pixels.
Yeah.
But they don't know that each one of those pixels consists of 3 dots, like a red dot, a blue dot, and a green dot. Together, those 3 dots make up a single pixel. Now, manufacturers, they will tell you how many dots it has, not how many pixels. Nor do they tell you the resolution. Right. Not monitor manufacturers, TV manufacturers, they just tell you the resolution, straightforward.
Okay.
Camera manufacturers, they'll tell you what the back screen is in dots. Like the very popular Sony a7 III has a rear screen that is 920,000 dots, so many dots. But in resolution, that is 640 by 480.
Now, if we put up a video on YouTube that's not done processing and it's 480p, the comments are brutal. Yet people are looking at their 480p little screens on their cameras and not really thinking about it.
Oh, I always thought about it. I always try to review my pictures and I would not know that something was completely out of focus until I got back on my computer that has a real screen. That 640 by 480 resolution on the a7 III screen is called VGA. That's a video standard that came out in 1987. That's how old this is. And we haven't seen monitors that low resolution anywhere else in our lives.
Yeah.
Like even our smartphones, they have a small screen, but our iPhones have 10 million dots if you were to put it into this weird standard. Full HD is 6 million dots, but the 4K A7S III, brand new, top of the line, $3,500 video camera, has a 1.4 million dot rear display. That's 800 by 600 pixels. It's incredibly low resolution, and it becomes obvious, like how am I supposed to manually focus a video camera with a screen that has 600 vertical lines when I'm trying to produce a 4K video?
Well, that's what's kind of interesting is that I've gone to look at a photo to see if it's in focus, and you zoom all the way in and you're like, I guess that looks pretty good, but you're not really sure until you get it on your high resolution monitor.
They're starting to address this. Like the a7 III, the screens are starting to get a little bit better, but if they would just tell us the actual normal resolution like any other display, I think it would actually help move the industry forward because it would increase awareness of how bad the screens we have been using have been.
Yeah, who's going to be the first camera to have like a really beautiful display and make every other one look bad?
The next point I want to bring up is the latency of mirrorless cameras. This is a big deal if you're using a mirrorless camera to shoot action, wildlife, any kind of sports. And it used to be so bad that you couldn't use mirrorless cameras for those things, but recent cameras have gotten better. And we've seen them, manufacturers start to talk about super low latency, like 20 millisecond latency through the viewfinder, and it should be totally acceptable. And we found that it has been in many cases.
Yeah, but this is a confusing one because you can look through your electronic viewfinder and you can be tracking something and there's no latency. It looks fine, it looks smooth, it looks natural. And then you press down your shutter and when you're trying to take pictures and track your subject, all of a sudden it's so laggy, you're losing your subject in the frame. And I had that happen to me so many times, Tony, where I just wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew something wasn't right. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize what was happening until you pointed out. You're like, oh, that's the latency. It's low, and so you're losing track of your subject. It was such a huge problem, I wouldn't even shoot wildlife or sports with a mirrorless camera. I had 2 different cameras. But now it seems like they're catching up and it's better. My R5 is a mirrorless camera, and it's great. It tracks, there's no latency, and it's not a problem. But you have to know to look for that, otherwise it becomes useless.
So don't listen to the manufacturer's spec on latency. Nobody tells you the latency while you're actually shooting. What I discovered testing the Sony A9 was I would have no problem tracking fast-moving subjects until I started to take pictures. And so I had to set up this high-speed camera and a metronome and actually measure it. And I found the latency while not shooting totally acceptable. But as soon as I held the shutter down, which I would be doing during the most intense moments, getting the best action pictures, the latency increased greatly.
Yeah.
To an unacceptable point, making it impossible to really keep that fast-moving subject while shooting. So you're forced to either just take like one picture and shoot in little bursts so you can catch up, or you just lose track of the subject, which is what kept happening to me. So that's valuable information for buyers, but also for shooters, because if you are forced to work around it, no, you can't just hold the shutter down with a big telephoto lens. You have to let up a little bit and let the camera catch up.
So that's like actually the spec that you need. The spec when you're tracking, of course, you would notice right away if the latency wasn't up to par, if it's just lagging before you even press the shutter. But it actually becomes the most crucial when you go to take the picture. So that's a frustrating spec. And I feel like they should really share both of those to make sure that it's an applicable feature. I really don't like when they tell you about a feature in the specs, but then it doesn't really work in the real world. That just seems kind of unfair to me.
Yeah, and I have a really frustrating one coming up, one that will make your full-frame camera behave more like an APS-C camera if you don't know about it. But first, a word from our sponsor, Squarespace.
Whether you need your own website or a portfolio like I have, you can make it happen with Squarespace, and it's really fast and easy to do. You can probably make your entire portfolio for free in like 10 minutes, and you get a 14-day free trial. Take your favorite photos, drag and drop them into a beautiful template that looks professional and clean and simple, and then when you're ready to go live and show off your photos on your website, you can get 10% off with the coupon code Chelsea. Try it out today. Go to squarespace.com/Chelsea, and like I said, use the coupon code Chelsea, and there's a link in the description below.
Thank you, Squarespace.
Okay, here's our next one, and this one's really tricky. Your buffer time versus your buffer size. Because when I was shooting with the Sony A9 when it was new, everybody kept telling me, oh, the buffer size is so big, the buffer size is so big.
200 raw photos,
Yeah.
you never fill it up.
And to me, I thought, okay, when I hear things, I'm like, that's probably true. But then you go to use it, and I'm holding down the shutter, and I'm getting at 20 frames per second, and then it's buffering. And it's taking a very long time to clear each photo. So you're taking a photo, and it starts buffering, and it's taking like a second per photo. And you can't shoot anymore, and you can't see your photos anymore. And could you even go through the menus? I don't remember.
No, it was really limited on what you can do. And once you did fill up that buffer, it could take 2 minutes to clear. So you didn't have to hold the shutter down for 10 seconds at 20 frames per second, fill up the 200 frame buffer. If you just shot in little bursts over the period of a couple of minutes, which is exactly what you do during the heat of the action of a hockey game or a sports game, you would eventually fill up the buffer. And that whole time you couldn't, say, switch to recording video or do lots of other features. Now, Sony went on to fix this with the A1. They switched to a different card that would be faster, but they bragged about the size of the buffer and glossed over the fact that it cleared extremely slowly because of their choice of memory cards.
I can't blame manufacturers because no one would want to highlight their inadequacies, No one wants to highlight the flaws of the feature. Of course they want to highlight what's good about it, which was the size of the buffer, but as a consumer, we have to kind of figure out which specs will work in a practical way. And this was what I was talking about before. I had a big buffer, but practically that wasn't working because it was too slow.
Specs versus real world,
Yes.
right? Speaking of.
Oh, this one drives me crazy.
Yes.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. When Fujifilm released the X-T3, I was so excited because it seemed like a jack-of-all-trades camera. That's when our daughter was doing soccer and I was shooting her games all the time. It advertised 30 frames per second for sports. And it was a camera I loved to use. So I immediately picked it up, shot a couple of games, and then I came back and I was like, this isn't working out the way I would expect.
Were you seeing not enough photos or what? What were you noticing?
Quite a few out-of-focus photos and definitely not 30 frames per second. Like, it just didn't seem that fast. And I went through and just counted, looking at the timestamps of the photos for all the photos shot within a single second when I was holding the shutter down the entire time. The best I got was like 13, and quite a few of those were out of focus. This is because the camera needs to take a beat and move the optics in the lens to get the subject in focus when it's moving, right? That takes some amount of time. It could do 30 frames per second if there was no movement or if I wasn't holding down the AF on button, but real world, I needed to track moving subjects. Why else would you be shooting at such a high frame rate?
Yeah,
and it ended up being extremely disappointing.
Who wants 30 frames of just something still? Like, you don't, when you shoot a still life, you don't just hold down your shutter for 30 seconds. Nothing has moved. You really only need that high frame rate for moving subjects. So if the autofocus isn't keeping up, then that kind of renders those extra frames useless.
And I got frustrated emails from people who bought the same camera based on those specs, just like I did, saying, what's wrong with me? Like, I'm shooting this, but I'm not getting the number of pictures. What am I doing wrong? Is there a setting I need to change? And I feel bad telling them, like, the only thing you did wrong was you trusted the advertising.
Yeah.
And we didn't discover it day one on the camera either. I had to spend some time with it. And so how long do you wait if you can't make purchasing decisions based on the information the manufacturer gives you? Like, how long do you wait for other reviewers to try to suss that out? It can take a long time.
It actually can take me months sometimes because something just won't feel right and I can't pinpoint what it is. And sometimes it will dawn on me, oh, this is probably what's happening.
A lot of this hides behind the false idea of user error.
Yeah.
That the user is doing something wrong, or they shouldn't be shooting that many pictures. Like, real photographers don't hold the shutter down.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of hides behind this whole culture of reviews for gear where you have to be the first one to get it out. And that doesn't give you a lot of time to live with the gear. It's really difficult to think of all this stuff under pressure, under the time constraints, knowing that if you don't get your review out within the first week, then it's not relevant anymore. And so it's tough to check all of this stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely happened to me where I had to fall back to simply repeating the press release, saying, oh, it has 20 frames per second, without actually being able to validate that. But all these little things clearly have to be validated because so many of them fall apart.
Are you going to make a checklist now? Make sure you check everything every time?
Maybe I should. And I want to talk about the number one frustrating thing, the thing that makes the biggest difference in people's photos that you're probably not aware of, and that's the T-stops of the lens. Now, T-stops, this requires a little bit of a nerdy background.
Okay. I give you permission to nerd out a little bit because this one's not that complicated.
And photographers, still photographers, talk about lenses in terms of f-stops. A lens will be a 24-105 f4 lens. And that f4 indicates, you think it indicates how much light passes through the lens, how much light that lens gathers, with lower numbers being better. f2 gathers 4 times more light than an f4 lens. But f-stops don't measure the light that comes out of the lens. They measure the relative size of the opening to the focal length.
The opening of the aperture.
Right. There is another measurement, T-stops. This measures the actual light output from the lens, how much light that lens is actually gathering. That is something that you care about if you ever shoot in low light conditions at all.
So f-stops is more like an equation, like the opening of the aperture versus the focal length. And T-stops is more like actually seeing how much light gets through your lens and how much gets trapped. Like if you held up a lens and you were to shine a flashlight, are the optics perfect enough that almost all of the light passes through?
Yes, if you had an optically perfect lens, f-stops would always equal T-stops.
Right.
But no lens is optically perfect. They all bounce a little bit of light off of the internal elements. I discovered this the hard way when we first tested the Canon 24-105 f4 versus the Sigma 24-105 f4 that was brand new. And for some reason, all my Canon shots were almost a full stop darker than the Sigma shots. And I was like, what's going on? Like there's some kind of exposure problem, something like that. And I tried it on different camera bodies. I locked all the settings in. No, the Sigma lens was just brighter. And that's when I learned the hard way that f-stops didn't measure the brightness of the lens. They told you almost nothing about how it's going to perform in low light.
So that would be applicable if you're doing something in low light photography. So if you want to do astrophotography where you want a lens that's going to let in a lot of light, you would actually want to know the T-stops because that's more important.
And it's almost impossible to find out the T-stop.
Unless-
Some lenses are available as cinema lenses.
Yeah.
And they will actually label them as T-stops. You know why? Because filmmakers care about the brightness of the lens. They switch between multiple cameras in a single scene, and they need the brightness to match exactly so they don't have to do complicated post-processing. You'll notice the difference in brightness as you switch between cameras, but you wouldn't notice it on a single still photo.
Yeah. So this is a complicated one, I guess, because you have your f-stop, which you think is the most important number, but it doesn't matter if the T-stops don't match, but you might not be able to get that number. Does DxOMark sometimes measure T-stops of a stills lens?
Yeah, they sometimes do, and it requires some pretty complicated equipment, which is why we can't easily do it on a regular basis.
We could try to match it up to the most optically perfect lens that we can find.
Yeah, maybe I should create some sort of benchmarking system, but that's a lot of work.
It. People aren't going to appreciate it. I don't think we should do it.
But I do want people to be aware that by looking at the f-stops, you're missing out on this key element. F-stops are like the horsepower of an engine, whereas T-stops are like a car's 0 to 60. You know, T-stops are measuring the output, the real world production of this piece of equipment, whereas f-stops are this like internal measurement of units that you might not actually be able to realize in the real world.
Maybe you can kind of get around this by choosing glass that's going to be well made, like Sony G Master lenses are usually really good optically sound lenses, whereas like a very cheap discount version of that might not be as good. So if that's very important to you, you might want to spend more on your Astro lenses or something.
Yeah, generally pro-grade lenses will have a difference between f-stops and T-stops of like 1/4 of a stop, whereas the consumer grade lenses can be 3/4 of a stop. And 3/4 of a stop is about the difference between full frame and medium format. Upgrading to a pro lens could be giving you like medium format levels of low light gathering capabilities, even if the f-stop numbers are the same. But again, you don't really know unless you measure the T-stops, which is kind of hard to find.
Tough. It's a tough one. We gave you the information on that one, but we kind of still give you a head scratcher.
I'd like to hear in the comments how you have been misled by these very theoretical specs. Did you previously chase specs, believing the manufacturer, thinking something was going to perform great, only to find out that you didn't have the full story? And thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace, who makes amazing websites incredibly easy. Go to squarespace.com/Chelsea. Set up your own website. Just try it out. It could be for work. It could be for fun. It could be just to show off your amazing work. It will take you just a few minutes, and you don't ever have to pay for it. You can just have fun with it. But I bet you're going to like it so much that you're going to want to subscribe. Use the coupon code Chelsea and get 10% off when you do that.
Thanks, Squarespace, and thanks all of you.